Welcome back. In this video, we are going to have a closer look at XAML. And you might wonder what XAML is. XAML is a type of XML language, as you can see here at the bottom. And actually, I'm gonna drag it even further. So XAML allows us to write our UI. So we don't need to go ahead and drag all the elements into our GUI and then adjust it in there. We can do all of that in code. Now you might say, oh, I'm more of a visual guy. I want to go ahead and drag the things in and I'm fine with that. Well, you can do that, but you are limited to just dragging around then. And with XAML, you can adjust a lot, and you can adjust not only those things like this wrapping that you have seen in the last video, you can do a lot more. And we will see what data binding is, what properties or dependency properties and so forth are, which are things that you can do with XAML, which allow us to create very great user interfaces which are easily maintainable. So in here, what you can see is this window, first of all. So pretty much generally what you have is you have an opening tag and you have a closing tag. If you know HTML, then you might, well, be familiar with that. You have the corner braces and you have them closing as well. So less than sign, the word, and then greater than sign. And you see we have the same thing with the window and here as well. Then when closing, you also have the slash just before the word. So this is the same for grid, for window, for anything else. So if I want, for example, to use a button, I can go ahead and do that. And if I use the greater than sign, it automatically creates the closing tag. Now what I can do is I can do all the adjustments inside of the opening tag. As you can see here, button, I can go ahead and, for example, add content to it. So there are many different properties, as you can see, and I'm just going to use the content property, and I'm just going to use something like click me. Now there is this button in the center, as you can see, and it says click me. Of course, we don't have a height, we don't have a width, all those kind of properties are not set yet. But let's say I want this button to be 50 pixels high. And then I want it to be 100 pixels wide. As you can see now, this is my button that I have created. Of course, I could have dragged it in, but doing it in XAML is quite useful. And now, something that I haven't touched on too much yet, and which is not going to be required until later in the course, but generally what you can see here are XML and S. What that stands for is for XML namespace, and XAML stands for Extensible Application Markup Language. So let me add that in here. Let's add a comment. I'm going to use a comment like that. As you can see, this is green now, and this is pretty much a comment. So I can write something in here, such as XAML is an extensible application markup language. All right, now the button, as you can see, is in here, and now let's go ahead and do some more things with buttons. So let's create some additional buttons. Please go ahead and create another button. Okay, I hope you tried it. Simply use the button name here, or the keyword, and then go ahead and create the additional button. Now you might wonder, oh damn, it's not positioning correctly. So I have this button and it has the content with hi there. So now where is this click me button now? Well, it's within the grid and it disappeared because we are using a grid, so the buttons don't appear on top of each other and so forth. So if you tried that, you have seen it. And we will look into grids later on as well. But I just wanted to show you that for now. All right, so let's get rid of that button again. Now we have this click me button, and let's just run the application so we can see how it actually looks in real life and how this whole thing can make our life beautiful by just clicking on it. So as you can see, I can hover over it and it changes its color, and I can click on it and it makes this little click animation, and that's it. But nothing happens when you click it. And there are multiple ways to implement a click functionality, and we will do that later on. All right, so that's how we can create a button in XAML. Now there are plenty of additional elements that we can access here, or properties. For example, we can access the font size property and increase the font size to, let's say, 32. So now the button is not as wide as the text, so let's adjust the width. So now it's fine again. We can see the whole text of the button. But when you play around with font size and all those elements, you have to be careful that it still fits in. Now, what you also can do is you can, instead of adding the content in here to the content property, you can simply add it within the button tags. So in here, I'm going to say something like click me. And as you can see, it's there. So this is the content. In between your tags is where you have your content. So that's one way of doing it. The other one is to simply use the content property here and assign the text like this, as we have seen before. Now, this closing tag button is not required if you simply close the button straight away like this. So you can close it in a shorter manner like that. So you don't need the closing tag button. And another way of designing a button is the following. So if you see something like that, that's totally fine as well. So you create the button tag, the closing and the opening one, and in here you have button dot, and then you can go ahead and adjust all the different properties that you want. So as you can see, there are many different properties that we can access. For example, the font size like that. So I can set the font size to 72 like that, for example. And another button property that I want to adjust is, let's say, the content. So I can go ahead and adjust the content to hi there. So now you see there is this huge button with a font size of 72 and it says hi there. So that's approach number 2. And there is even something else that you can do. So let's adjust that button even further. So let's say as the content, I don't want to have just a text of hi there. I want to go even further. I want to add a wrap panel. Now what a wrap panel does is it simply wraps all of its controls or elements next to each other, going from left to right. So the first element is going to be, let's say, a text block, and we have seen what text blocks are. They are simple text, and this one is going to say multi. Now I need another text block and a third one. So now it says multi 3 times. But now what I can do is I can adjust the color of every single aspect. So, or of every single text block. So let's say I change that to blue. Then this has the foreground. So foreground is the color, the foreground color. And this one will be red. And finally, my last text block will have the foreground of white. And now instead of multi, it says multicolor button. And now maybe we want to adjust the font size a little. Let's make it smaller. Also, the first button, as you can see, it's hidden because the grid only displays the last element if they are not assigned in the right grid structure, which we will see later on. But let's get rid of the first button that we had. And now let's also set a button size. So let's go ahead and use button.width, which will be, let's say, 200, and a button.height, which will be 100. And like that. So there we are. And the font size is too big to fit everything in. So if we go ahead and do that with 24, now it's in there. So if I run the code, I'll have a multicolor button which has multiple different text blocks in it. And there we are. So just so you see, there are multiple different approaches of doing it. If you want to wrap multiple aspects into it, then you can use this wrap panel. You could even use a grid within the button and use the grid tag in order to create multiple different controls inside of your button. But that's something that we'll cover later on. For now, it's just important for you to understand that XAML allows you to do plenty of fancy stuff with your GUI without having to drag and drop, and also with full control over how things look and what they do. Now what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna comment that out, and I'm gonna show you how to do the same thing as we have seen here with code, because we've seen it with XAML code, but we can also do it in code behind, which means in C#, which we pretty much learned for the whole class so far, or for the whole course. So let's go into the code behind. As you can see, there is a .xaml file, which is the one that we have opened here, the main window.xaml, and every XAML file has a code behind file, which is a .xaml.cs file. And this one is a C# file, which means we have a C# partial class in here, which we can now use in order to adjust or create our UI. And as you can see, it's called main window and it inherits from window. And in here, we have a method called main window, which is similar to the main method in our console applications that we have seen so far. This one is called as soon as the window is open, or as soon as the application is started. And as you can see here, there is initialize component called, which simply initializes everything else, which is required for our window to run. For example, it initializes this title, and it initializes the size and so forth. And now we can go ahead and write our own code in here. So I'm going to show you how to create a button first. So first of all, we need a grid in which we can assign that button. So I'm going to call it grid, which is a new grid. Then I set the content of this to my grid. What that will do is I simply say the main window, it should have some content, right? As we have seen in the XAML file. So window, this tag here opens, and everything that is between those opening and closing tags is my, so pretty much this whole content here, this is the content of my window. And what I say here is this .content should be the grid. So we create a new grid as we have seen here. So we have a grid here as well, which is a opening and a closing tag of the grid here. And now I set that as its content. And now I can add stuff to this grid. For example, I can add a button to the grid. First of all, let's create that button. And I'm going to call it btn is going to be a new button. Now I have that button and I can adjust its properties. So let's say I want to set the font size of my button, and I can simply do it that way. I can simply say it's going to be something like 26. Now in our button, as you have seen here, we had a wrap panel, which is the content of the button. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a wrap panel, and I'm going to call it wrap panel. Is going to be a new wrap panel. Now we can add things to the wrap panel. We add the wrap panel to the button, and we add the button to the grid. And the grid is already part of our content. So now let's go ahead and create all the stuff that we want to add to the wrap panel and add it to that. So we need a text block first. And the text block, as you have seen here, is this one here. So we create 1, 2, 3 text blocks. And the first one is going to be txt, is going to be new text block. And I simply say txt.text. So it has a text property, this text here, which is the content. So for the button, the content is called content, and for the text block, the text itself is called text. So we access the text property of our text block, and we set that to multi. Then next, we set the color. So text.foreground is going to be brushes dot and which color did I have first? For the multi, it was blue. All right, so I'm gonna make that blue. And as you can see, brushes, well, text is done with brushes. So the color of text is done with the brushes class. So I need to use this brushes class and then access its color. So solid color brush of type brushes. And next, I can add that to the wrap panel. So now that I have the text, I can add it to the wrap panel, and I do that by accessing its children and adding my text to it. So that's how I add one text block. And if we would run that, we wouldn't see anything yet because we didn't add the wrap panel to the button yet, and neither the button to the grid, but we will do that in a second. So let's go ahead and adjust the text, or actually adjust those three pieces again. So what we do is next we adjust the text to multicolor, and the last one was button. And now we had the color red and we had the color white. Okay, so I just copied and pasted those three lines because they are the same. I don't need to create a new text block every time. I just add the old one and then I adjust it, or I adjust its values, and then I add it again to the wrap panel. So now I have those three texts in my wrap panel. And what I can do now is I can add the wrap panel to my button. So button.content is going to be my wrap panel. And finally, grid.children.add, and in here I add my button. So that's what I was talking about. So we have the grid, we have the button, we have the wrap panel, and now we add those texts to the wrap panel. We add the wrap panel to the button, we add the button to the grid, and we added the grid to the window. And as you can see, this is how you can do it with code. And before we run the code, what I need to do is actually to comment the grid out as well. So I actually can only have the window. So there's only the window in our main window.xaml file, and all the other code is within our main window.xaml.cs, which is the code behind. So this file is the code behind of our main window.xaml. Now there is one thing missing before we test that, and that is that I assign a new text block to my text. So I need to do that for both of my texts. So the thing is that we created text here and we initialize it with a new text block. And now we need to create a new text block and assign it to our text before we can add that to our wrap panel. So now that we have that, we can run the code. And we will see that we also have our multicolor button. And as you can see, we have done the same thing that we have done before with XAML, which was this here, which also looks pretty simple and neat. We did it with C# code like that. Now you can go the way you prefer, but we will mainly work with XAML. I just wanted to show you that you can, whatever you do with XAML, you can do with code behind as well, but sometimes it makes a lot more sense to use code behind. So for example, if you want to adjust something dynamically, then code behind makes more sense. So running it with C# or making the adjustments with C#. And the XAML makes more sense when you have static user interfaces. And by the way, whenever you create this XAML file, like we have here, what it does is it goes ahead and creates this code behind file. So it simply creates this code and runs it once the application starts to run, once our main window is called. So it's done anyways, and we do it like that with XAML, or we do it manually by creating the code. So now you could of course argue, hey, there is something like this width and this height which you haven't set. Well, I can do that very easily here. I could simply say button.width, and I could set that to 150, and button.height and set that to 100, for example. Then the button will be adjusted accordingly. And as you can see, now it's spread over 2 lines. Alrighty, so that's XAML and the code behind with code. I know it was a long video, but we are going to see even more fancy, cool WPF things in the next video. So see you there.